A man stands alone on a tropical shoreline, staring at a 4-ton log of solid timber. He is not a sailor by trade. He is a former military pilot who flew jet fighters and helicopters for over 20 years. But today, he holds only an axe, a fire starter, and a plan that sounds almost impossible: to carve this single log into a seaworthy canoe and sail it 1,500 kilometers through one of the most unforgiving marine environments on Earth, the Great Barrier Reef. He is not chasing a record. He is chasing a ghost. The ghost of a teenage sailor who washed ashore on this same coast more than 170 years ago and somehow survived. His name is Michael Atkinson, though most know him by his trail name, Outback Mike. Born in Canberra, he spent more than 2 decades flying for Australia's military, time that took him deep into the country's remote north. It was there, alongside Indigenous trackers and bushmen, that he first learned the old skills: how to read the land, how to live off it, and how thin the line really is between comfort and survival. When his service ended, he didn't retire to a quiet life. He turned to expedition filmmaking, recreating historical journeys of endurance, not to relive the past as fiction, but to test, in his own body, whether the old stories were even possible. To understand why Michael built this canoe, you have to go back to 1846. A merchant ship called the Peruvian wrecked off the coast of what is now North Queensland. Among the survivors who drifted ashore on a makeshift raft was a young sailor named James Morrill. Most of his shipmates did not survive the ordeal. Morrill did, but not because of any skill of his own. He was found half-starved and dying of thirst by the Birigubba people, the traditional custodians of that stretch of coastline. Instead of leaving him to die, as a stranger with no claim on their hospitality, they took him in. What followed was one of the most remarkable survival stories in Australian history, though for a very long time, it remained largely forgotten. James Morrill did not simply survive a few weeks in the bush. He lived among the Birigubba people for 17 years. He learned their language, their seasonal movements, their methods for finding food and fresh water in a landscape that looked, to European eyes, almost barren. He learned to read tides, to track game, to build shelter from materials at hand. By the time he was eventually found by European settlers in 1863, he had become, in every practical sense, a different man, shaped entirely by the knowledge of the people who had saved his life. It is this knowledge, passed down through generations long before Morrill ever arrived, that Michael Atkinson set out to honor. Decades of expeditions had taught Michael one thing above all: the only way to truly understand a survival story is to attempt it yourself, stripped of modern conveniences. So he asked a simple but enormous question. Could James Morrill, in theory, have built a vessel and escaped north along the coast, toward the Torres Strait, where ships occasionally passed? There was no historical record of Morrill attempting this, but the question became an obsession. If a vessel could be built using only the materials and methods available in the 1800s, then maybe, just maybe, the same waters that had nearly killed Morrill could also be survived and even conquered by single-log craftsmanship and grit. Every dugout canoe begins with a single tree. Michael selected a massive Norfolk pine, a species prized for centuries by Pacific and Indigenous boat builders for its straight grain, lightweight density, and natural resistance to splitting. The log weighed close to 4 tons. There was no shortcut here, no machine to do the heavy lifting of imagination. Just months of work ahead, guided by instinct rather than blueprint. "I didn't follow any plans," he would later explain, "because the people who built canoes like this centuries ago didn't have plans to follow either. I just had to visualize what the shape needed to be to survive the conditions." The hollowing process is where ancient technique meets brute patience. Controlled fires were lit along the top of the log, burning the wood just enough to soften and char it. Then, with axe and adze, the charred layer was scraped away, inch by inch, before the next fire was set. This fire and blade cycle repeated for weeks, a rhythm of burning, scraping, burning again, gradually carving out a hull thin enough to float, yet thick enough to survive open ocean swells. It is one of the oldest boat building methods known to humanity, practiced by cultures from the Pacific Islands to the river systems of Africa and the Americas, long before metal tools existed. Once the hull was hollowed, the real shaping began, refining the bow and stern, balancing the hull's draft, and adding a double outrigger for stability in open water, a feature found in traditional vessels across the Pacific. To make the wood watertight, Michael turned to natural resins and plant-based sealants, the same category of materials boat builders relied on for thousands of years before synthetic compounds existed. Every seam, every joint, every place water might find its way in had to be sealed by hand. After 14 months of work, nearly 4 times longer than he had originally planned, the Canoe was finally ready. He named her the Salty Kangaroo. From Townsville, the city closest to where Morrill's story began, the Salty Kangaroo was finally lowered into the water. There was no fanfare, no support vessel trailing behind. Only one man, one canoe, and the open expanse of the Great Barrier Reef stretching north toward Cape York and eventually the Torres Strait. The plan was audacious. 1,500 kilometers, much of it through reef channels with no reliable charts for a vessel like this, living almost entirely off what the land and sea provided. Cyclone season was approaching fast. There would be no second attempt if something went wrong. The Great Barrier Reef is not one continuous reef, but a maze of thousands of individual coral systems, sandbars, and channels stretching over 2,000 kilometers. For a single log canoe with no engine, navigating it meant reading wind, tide, and current with total precision. Mistakes here are not forgiving. Days blurred into a rhythm, paddling at dawn before the trade winds picked up, anchoring in sheltered lagoons through the heat of midday, foraging oysters and reef fish for food, and sleeping under whatever shelter the coastline offered. Isolation became its own kind of weather system, pressing in during the long, silent hours between landmarks, with nothing but reef, sky, and the sound of water against ancient wood. No expedition like this goes exactly to plan. Weeks into the voyage, the toll began to show. Living almost entirely off foraged food led to serious malnourishment. Michael's body weight dropped sharply as the physical demands of paddling outpaced what the reef could reliably provide. The canoe itself, for all its careful construction, began to suffer too, seams opening under the relentless stress of open water, requiring repeated emergency repairs on remote beaches. And then there were the crocodiles, apex predators sharing every river mouth and mangrove channel he needed to pass through, demanding constant vigilance even in moments of complete exhaustion. This was not a reenactment performed at a safe distance from danger. It was the real thing. What carried Michael through the hardest stretches wasn't just grit, it was knowledge. Before the voyage even began, he spent weeks meeting Aboriginal communities along the route in person, listening to their advice on currents, food sources, and country he didn't yet understand. It mirrored, in its own way, exactly what had saved James Morrill nearly 2 centuries earlier. Survival made possible not through isolation, but through connection to people who already held the answers. The journey became less about one man's endurance and more a tribute to a body of knowledge that had sustained life on this coastline for tens of thousands of years. After roughly 2 months at sea, battered, malnourished, and far lighter than the man who had launched from Townsville, Michael Atkinson reached the waters near the Torres Strait, close to Booby Island, the same historic rescue haven that stranded sailors had once relied on for supplies in the age of sail. The canoe that almost failed had held. The question he set out to answer had its answer. Yes, with the right knowledge, the right materials, and an extraordinary amount of will, a single log really could carry a person to safety across one of the most dangerous coastlines on Earth. A 4-ton log, fire, resin, and one man's refusal to let an old story stay forgotten. That is what it took to retrace in modern form a survival that began with a shipwreck in 1846. The Salty Kangaroo now stands not just as a boat, but as proof that ancestral knowledge, carved and tested by hand, still holds its strength against the modern sea.